Hello, hello, hello. There is a YouTuber called Paul Joseph Watson who makes some very interesting videos, of which I'm a big fan. And he made a video some time ago entitled Paedophiles Rule the World. And it reflects a conspiracy theory, really, an idea that paedophiles and ebophiles and those that are sexually attracted to children or underage people are somehow overrepresented in positions of power in Western countries and attempt to do their best to help each other out and, if you like, maintain a kind of paedophile ascendancy. Now, this is often, because of Pizzagate and things like this is often dismissed as a kind of bizarre conspiracy theory, that you'd have to be an absolute nutter to believe something like this. And it got me thinking. It got me thinking. It would be very difficult to test this because if you're talking about the idea that people who are paedophiles are strongly overrepresented in positions of extreme power and influence. Going about defining where the borders are of extreme power and influence and so forth is difficult. But one thing that could be looked into is whether it is theoretically likely that paedophiles would ascend by virtue of being paedophiles to positions of extreme power and influence in a way that would make them overrepresented. This interested me, and so this is what I'd like to talk about today. Do we have a paedophile ascendancy? Is it theoretically likely that paedophiles would be overrepresented in positions of significant power and influence? Now, before I look into that, I want to look into the background of this. I want to look into why Paul Joseph Watson or myself or whatever are even talking about this. Now, in a British context, it really began with a British entertainer and TV personality and disc jockey called Sir Jimmy Savile. Sir Jimmy Savile died in 2011, and for those of you who aren't British, I can't stress enough that Sir Jimmy Savile was just mega famous in the UK. A kind of, throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, particularly into the 90s, everybody had heard of Jimmy Savile. Jimmy Savile was constantly on the television. Jimmy Savile hosted the main music programs in the 60s and 70s. Jimmy Savile did a program called Jim will Fix It in the 80s, where children would write in and Jim would fix it for them to do various things they wanted to do. And I mean, he was just untouchable, incredibly powerful. Sir Jimmy Savile, he was knighted, he was good friends with Margaret Thatcher, he was friendly with the royal family, he had a papal knighthood. I mean, this person was adored, but he was always regarded as a bit of a weirdo, a bit of an oddball, as this bachelor who never seemed to have any relationships and was strangely close to his mother, whom he referred to as the Duchess. When he died in 2011, it came to light not long after he died that he was basically a serial sexual abuser, and in particular a serial sexual abuser of young girls. He'd been allowed to. He had contact with a woman who was in charge of a school, a private boarding school for intelligent but mentally disturbed young girls, in their teens, and he used to go there and sexually abuse them and get them to do sexual favours for him in return for them being taken to the BBC and things like this. He had access to hospitals because he used to do a lot of charity work, and this gave him access to a particular hospital where he would go and basically sexually abuse patients. There's some rumours that he even used to have sex with corpses in this hospital. So this was obviously a very, very perverted man. And it came out that after he died, that hundreds and hundreds, I mean, this person was a multiple sexual abuser, but it was basically underage girls. That's what he was interested in. He was, well, not perhaps a paedophile, but an ebophile. And indeed there were some cases where I think those who he were abusing, it was argued, were prepubescent, which would make him a paedophile. This set in train something called Operation U-Tree, which was a police inquiry into past cases of historical sex abuse. And this threw up various other very eminent and very, very famous and influential people, who were part of the establishment, who had knighthoods and titles awarded by the government and so on. One of these was Rolf Harris. He was another highly, highly respected entertainer. Rolf Harris, CBE, Commander of the British Empire, which is the rank directly below knighthood. And it turned out that he'd been abusing underage girls as young as 9. There was another case of somebody called Stuart Hall, OBE, Order of the British Empire, the rank below CBE, and he was found guilty of 13 counts of sexually abusing underage girls aged between 9 and 17 between 1967 and 1986. Then there was the case of Sir Clement Freud, who died in 2009, and there were reasonably believable allegations that he'd been abused. This is the grandson of Sigmund Freud, and he was an entertainer and on TV a lot and radio a lot, and he'd been abusing underage girls. There was a case of Sir Cyril Smith. Sir Cyril Smith was a particularly overweight and portly Liberal, which is the third party in the UK, Liberal member of Parliament. He died in 2010, and he was very much a celebrity in his lifetime. Sir Cyril Smith, knighted, you see, very much a celebrity, very well known, a household name, and it transpired that he had been abusing since the 50s or whatever. He'd born in the 20s. He'd been abusing underage boys, sexually and physically abusing underage boys. And there was a case of somebody called Sir Gravel Jenner, later Lord Jenner, so he was given a peerage. That's how eminent he was. He died in 2015, and there were 22. He was not permitted to stand trial because it was believed by the Crown Prosecution Service that he was mentally unfit to stand trial because he apparently had Alzheimer's or dementia of some kind. He was accused of 22 counts of buggery and indecent assault of boys between 1969 and 1986. There was the case of Sir Peter Morrison, who was Mrs. Thatcher's private secretary, and there were believable allegations that he had gone to children's homes where he had been frequently sexually abusing underage boys. There was a member of Parliament called Geoffrey Dickens who presented a dossier in 1984 to Leon Britton, who was the later Sir Leon Britton, later Lord Britton, who was the Home Secretary, the Interior Minister in the UK, in which he listed all of these people in positions of power and influence and authority who were paedophiles or ebophiles, and this dossier mysteriously went missing. And then one of the people whom was accused later of engaging in this kind of activity was Leon Britton himself, although these allegations were refuted supposedly in an inquiry. Then there was an investigation into all this, into what was going on, and the investigation was botched. The various judges that were put in charge of this investigation into historical sex offences kept resigning. It was evidence that the police investigation into it was botched. Then it came to light that in 1992 there had been a trial, and the trial was dropped because it seemed that one of the witnesses was going to testify that the former Prime Minister Edward Heath, who was Prime Minister from 1970 to 1974 and took Britain into the European Union, had been involved with rent boys. And so on this basis, the trial was dropped. So in many ways, this was a kind of conspiracy theorist's dream. There was so much about, there were various allegations against people. One of them was Harvey Proctor, who was a former Conservative MP, which were refuted and so on. And there was a whole kind of hysteria at the time about this. David Cameron went on morning television, who was Prime Minister at the time, to be interviewed about it, and then he was confronted with this list of names by Philip Schofield, who was the host, and Schofield asked, have you talked to these people? One of them was Lord McAlpine, who used to be a Conservative Party treasurer, and he then sued people that argued he was a paedophile, and they had to pay him damages because there wasn't sufficient proof. But everything about it implied that something was going on. And more recently, it transpired that people knew the rumours. People knew while Cyril Smith was eminent, before Cyril Smith was even given a knighthood, that people knew these rumours and understood that he was involved in sexually and physically abusing children. And people, even in the 70s, there was a case of the singer from the Sex Pistols who went on the radio in the 70s, and he'd heard these rumours, and he said that Jimmy Savile was involved in all kinds of seediness. And this resulted in him being barred from radio interviews for quite a long time. So people knew this. There was, as it were, a conspiracy of silence. It was more socially acceptable to physically and sexually abuse children, perhaps, in the 1970s, and it was more taboo to talk about it. And people were kind of covering this up and trying to stop it from coming out. So this implied, certainly in the UK context, that there were a significant number of people in establishment positions, knighthoods, OBEs, CBEs, peerages, who were engaged in this kind of activity. This is something that will be perhaps quite difficult to test because, as I say, where do you draw the line of what level of eminence it is to try and get a representative sample? But it's certainly of interest, this idea that paedophiles are overrepresented among people who ascend to pronounced positions of power and influence. Now, this got me. This is a conspiracy theorist. You can dismiss it as a conspiracy theory, but it becomes less likely to be a conspiracy theory if it can be at least theoretically, if it's theoretically justifiable. It makes sense. Now, why would you engage in this kind of behaviour? Why would you rape people, and why would you rape underage people? Well, it seems to me that there's two dimensions involved. One is simply psychopathology, that you're a psychopath, which means that you lack empathy, you lack love for other people, you don't care about their feelings, and so you just do whatever you want. And the other is simply that you are you are paedophile, you have some sort of sexual disturbance you've developed in some sexually suboptimal way, which makes you attracted to, in particular and specifically, to underage boys or underage girls or whatever. Now, in terms of psychopathology, there was a study by someone called Post, which was published in about 1994, called Creativity and Psychopathology, and it was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry. And he came up with a sample of particularly eminent men, eminent in the fields of writing, in the fields of the arts, in the fields of politics, and in various other fields. And what he found was that about 10% of the about 10% of the population could be regarded amongst males as being psychopathic, but this was moderately higher among eminent men. So 14% of eminent men were psychopathic. Now, it could be argued that this makes sense because in order to become eminent, in order to become very famous or whatever, you have to have a certain degree of drive. I've talked about in other videos the nature of genius. What is genius? Geniuses are eminent men. Geniuses combine very high intelligence with this moderately antisocial personality, basically with moderately psychopathic personality. And the reason that this predicts eminence is that if you are psychopathic, your impulse control tends to be quite low, so you aren't constrained by the rules of the game, and this allows you to think outside the box and so on. But also, it means that you don't care about the feelings of others. You don't care about offending people, and new ideas and new ways of doing things and whatever almost always offend vested interests, but you don't care about this. And so this rare combination of psychological characteristics allows you to reach relative eminence. So it makes sense. 10% of male population may be psychopaths, and 14% of eminent men. But he found that the psychopathology was rather higher among highly creative types, that is to say artists and writers and so on, than among politicians, where it was only 11%, so only a little bit above the average for the population. But then he looks at what he called subclinical psychopathology. So this is not the archetypal psychopath, but a person who has aspects of psychopathology, a person who is just about within the normal range, but is, you wouldn't want to be around this person too much. Subclinical psychopathology. Here it was different. 16% of men were subclinically psychopathic, compared to 52% of politicians, 50% of artists, and 70% of eminent writers. So suddenly you can start to see that on that level, being purely psychopathic perhaps isn't going to help you that much, because it means that you're going to be so appallingly behaved that you might end up in prison or whatever. So actually perhaps it's going to damage your ability to become eminent. But if you're subclinically psychopathic, if you're, as it were, moderately psychopathic, then it seems you can get very far in life, because then 70%, over 2/3 of eminent writers are subclinically psychopathic, and over half of highly eminent politicians are subclinically psychopathic, and this gives them the ruthlessness and so on to succeed. Now, it is these characteristics, of course, being psychopathic or subclinically psychopathic, that is going to be associated with rape and with just using people for your own sexual needs. So in that sense, you would expect psychopaths to be overrepresented, including rapists, or people prone to rape, among very eminent men. And so this would be consistent with this theory, with this idea that paedophiles rule the world, that Paul Joseph Watson, has discussed. It theoretically would fit with this. And indeed, there is a book by a psychologist at Oxford called Kevin Dutton, no relation to me, or if he is a very distant relation to me, which looks at this, which looks at the degree to which psychopaths, as he calls them, but he uses the term broadly to include, I think, subclinical psychopaths, are overrepresented among men in positions of power. Now, another thing that was Post looked at was narcissism. Narcissism is a disorder which is related to psychopathology, where you have an inflated sense of self-worth, an inflated sense of self-esteem, an incredible sense of entitlement, and so on. But basically, you think you're brilliant. You are a narcissist. He found that 1% of the male population can be regarded as narcissists. However, he found it was 27% of artists, 28% of politicians, 27% of artists, and 28% of politicians, and 40% of writers. Now, how would narcissism, how would narcissism help you in these professions? Well, obviously, you can see that if you're a writer, or a politician, or not, there's a degree to which to become eminent. It's not good enough to just be talented. You've got to have the self-belief to push yourself to the fore and to promote yourself and to get people to look at you and listen to you and take you seriously. And this takes high self-esteem. You can be a brilliant artist, fantastic artist, but if you've got a low sense of self-esteem and of what you're worth, you're going to just let your artworks pile up in the shed and they're not going to be discovered until you die, even if maybe they won't be discovered at all. You've got to have a sense of your own importance to push yourself forward like that. So you can see how this works. Now, narcissists are low in empathy. They lack empathy, and therefore narcissistic personality does predict these kinds of behaviour patterns, these manipulative behaviour patterns, where you use people for your own gratification, where you don't really care about other people. And so again, narcissism, which predicts eminence, clearly, including in politics, would predict a propensity to use and abuse people, would predict a propensity to rape. Anxiety itself is associated very specifically with success in the world of the arts. Daniel Nettle looks at this in his book Personality, Anxiety and a Proneness to Depression. And this seems to be because it makes you creative, it makes you you've got this unstable world and you want to kind of make sense of it and you want to express how you feel so that you can give yourself a sense of certainty. And so you channel your energies into the arts. And also, if people that suffer from anxiety will go through periods of kind of religious or pseudo-religious fervour, where they will feel very, very good about themselves, and this can be channeled into the arts as well. And so you'll just see the world in an unusual, interesting way. And so you can see how this would be something which would elevate success, and it does elevate success in the world of the arts. And also, it was found that more generally in academia, there is an optimum level of anxiety and mental instability, which predicts doing well in that area, but presumably because it acts as a motivator. It acts as a motivator to work hard, because you're very, very concerned and anxious about failure. No good being too anxious, then it just becomes crippling and so on. But an optimum level of anxiety seems to predict success. In the world of the arts, and indeed in life in general. There's an optimum level of anxiety that works. Now, there's a very interesting paper called, I will always put, by the way, for people to ask for my references, the references in the box below the video, called The Neurobiology and Psychopathology of Paedophilia. And what it found was that among paedophiles and ebophiles, that's to say those that go for pubescent people, 2/3 of them suffer from anxiety, and 20% of them are narcissistic. So this is quite interesting. It means that people who are anxious tend to be overrepresented in the arts and in these kinds of arenas and so on, overrepresented among the eminent, and 2/3 of those who have hebephilia suffer from anxiety, and narcissists are manifestly overrepresented in positions of power, and 20% of those who have haemophilia. This is what Jimmy Savile was. He was basically a haemophiliac. It was pubescent girls that he was interested in, underage pubescent girls, are narcissistic. Now, one of the things that predicts eminence is, of course, IQ. In general, there is an association, of about 5 between socioeconomic status and IQ, and those who are geniuses overwhelmingly have a very, very high IQ indeed, something that's been looked at by Daniel Simonton in his, by Dean K. Simonton in his research on the subject of genius. Now, paedophiles and ebophiles have lower average IQ than the general population, but this may be a consequence of the very low IQ of those who engage in the abuse of the very, very young, babies and toddlers and things like this. And this may well be caused by the fact that a part of IQ is to do with a low level of genetic mutation in the brain, so that the brain is working optimally. And you would expect people that had mutations, things wrong with their mind, such that they were attracted to babies or whatever, which has no evolutionary benefit at all, so it's bound to be some kind of mutation involved. Their brains would be working suboptimally due to this mutational load, and so you'd expect them to have low IQ. So this may be a factor in this association. Another factor in the association may be that simply that when they do these surveys, we're talking about convicted paedophiles and ebophiles, because there's loads of people out there who are paedophiles and ebophiles who think in this way, but who never get caught. And obviously it's more likely to be the low IQ people that are going to get caught and do stupid things like download child pornography or whatever and get themselves caught. And so the low IQ, supposedly low IQ of paedophiles, may be an artifact of these kinds of factors. It may not actually be that pronounced in reality. Now, so there's the low IQ. A number of things seem to predict developing into being a paedophile. One of them is parental age. So the older your parents are, and particularly the older your mother is, the more likely you are to be to develop into being a paedophile. A likely reason for that is, again, this issue of mutation, of mutant genes. The older your parents are, the more likely they are to pass on, suboptimal, there's the father, for example, suboptimal semen, mutant semen, which causes problems in the children. This is one of the reasons why autism is associated with having an old father, because the father has genetically damaged semen, more damaged semen the older he gets. And so consequently, you'll have more de novo mutations in the semen, resulting in problems for the children. I mean, it's been suggested, for example, the reason why Queen Victoria was a haemophiliac was, her father was 50 or something when she was conceived, and it would have been a de novo mutation, which she inherited for haemophilia. So parental age seems to be an issue, and particularly maternal age. But again, it's quite interesting. You can see that being a paedophile is associated with the two, particularly narcissism, with the key personality factors which are themselves associated with eminence. And an aspect of paedophilia, particularly if you're raping somebody or whatever, is going to be also psychopathology. You're going to get paedophiles who are psychopaths and those who aren't. And the psychopathology, you're going to get those who have these desires and don't act on them, who have these desires and, let's say, they become school teachers or something, and so they can sort of touch children occasionally and enjoy their company, but they manage to suppress their desires, or scoutmasters, or what are the other jobs that are going to be attractive to Catholic priests, whatever other jobs are going to be attractive to paedophiles, so they can be in touch with people who they're attracted to. They can sort of touch them, they can gain satisfaction that way, and you're going to get those who, that's not good enough, and they have insufficient morality, i.e. sufficient psychopathology to go beyond that and to actually abuse people. And this is what you get with people like Jimmy Savile and Cyril Smith and so on. So you can see then that these issues that cause eminence are also associated with paedophilia and ebophilia. Now, why? Well, one issue with anxiety, we can see why anxiety would be relevant, because anxiety in general is associated with fetishes. And the reason for this seems to be the degree to which a fetish is associated with trauma. And this is one of the reasons why paedophilia, people who are paedophiles, have often been sexually abused themselves as children, because this association between anxiety. If you're an anxious person, if you're high in neuroticism, then you experience negative feelings more strongly, and you're more likely to be kind of traumatized. And it seems to be this that is associated with certain sexual aberrations, such as paedophilia and fetishes and so on. So let's say if it was something like spanking fetishism, which I look at in my book Churchill's Headmaster, The Sadist Who Nearly Saved the British Empire. With spanking fetishism, let's say somebody is spanked as a child or witnesses a spanking as a child, and this kind of traumatizes them in some way. And then when they are sexually maturing, they repress this memory, and when they are sexually maturing, they, let's say, see a pair of buttocks that sexually arouses them or something like that, and this memory is reawakened, and the two things are kind of fused. And they start this traumatic memory, and they start to become sexually aroused by, let's say, spanking others or being spanked. Also this trauma people tend to deal with trauma by reenacting it. It allows them to kind of take control of it, and by reenacting it, by extroverting the trauma, by bringing it to life and doing it again and again and again. It's a kind of obsessive compulsive disorder, and this is something that's also associated, by the way, with anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. And so you can see how these kind of fetishes would develop in people who are highly anxious, but how, of course, also anxiety would be something which acts as a motivator, and with an optimum level of it is associated with eminence. So you can see how this kind of follows. Now, in terms of the causes, then, of this association, this paedophile ascendancy, the first seems to me obviously to be anxiety. I mean, that's obviously a key factor. Also, a second factor, it seems to me, if it were among the upper class, among those who were ascendant, might be that we have had we were under Darwinian conditions until about 1800, and then after that Darwinian selection broke down, we went from 40% child mortality to about 1% child mortality. Those children that wouldn't have survived under Darwinian conditions would have been children with high mutational load. High mutational load of the body, i.e., a poor immune system which would have killed you under Darwinian conditions, tends to correlate with high mutational load of the mind, because the mind makes up 88% of the genome and is thus a larger target for mutation. So this is why paedophiles, for example, tend to have all kinds of other conditions which imply physical mutations, such as high levels of left-handedness and high levels of allergies and things like this. And so you can see how this becomes a matter of mutation. You have mutant genes which cause people to be sexually attracted to those who can't possibly conceive or are unlikely to be able to conceive because they're too young, or whatever. Socioeconomic status is strongly genetic. There's a book by Gregory Clark called The Sun Also Rises, which finds that across generations it tends to be about 70% genetic. So this means that the upper class now are, to a substantial degree, descendants of the upper class a century or more ago, not completely, but to a substantial degree. And so this upper class their selection pressures would have reduced earlier. They would have had healthier conditions earlier. They would have stopped, their child mortality would have and did fall earlier. So that class has been under less genetic selection than people lower down the scale. Less Darwinian selection, and so you would expect there to be more mutation, more maladaptive genes among that class, and one of those might relate to a higher level of paedophilia. So there's a degree to which, I mean, this is purely speculation, but there's a degree to which that might fit. However, when it comes to those from the bottom of the social scale, and that's quite interesting because that's what Jimmy Savile was. Jimmy Savile was from a very poor background. Cyril Smith was from a very, very poor background, indeed illegitimate, single mother, this kind of thing in Lancashire. Very, very poor backgrounds. Ted Heath wasn't from a particularly well-off background. Then there's perhaps something else going on. Indeed, in general, it's relatively rare for people to socially ascend. It's not a common thing, and when it does happen, it's often by sort of an unlikely combination of genes will mean that a child is much more or much less intelligent than their parents. Another possibility is simply mutation. You might get somebody born into a poor background who simply by chance has a mutant gene which makes them highly intelligent or highly motivated or whatever, and so they move up the society. That might be what's going on, and that might explain what we see with Cyril Smith or whatever, that they some mutation, which means they're much cleverer than their parents. Now, if they have one mutation, mutations tend to be comorbid with other mutations. So if they have a mutation for, let's say, high IQ, then they are likely to have other mutations, including for problems which will manifest in terms of paedophilia or sexual perversion, or that kind of thing. So, I mean, this is obviously, I can't stress enough, of course, this is speculative. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But I think there may be an extent to which Paul Joseph Watson has a point when he talks about paedophiles ruling the world. It's a conspiracy theory, but it's a conspiracy theory which seems to be congruent, which seems to be something that can be logically justified via the available studies. The studies would indicate that it's quite conceivable that paedophiles and ebophiles would be overrepresented among those in positions of power and influence, and this is what is being suggested by this conspiracy theory, and this conspiracy theory fits with the available evidence. So it may not be that much of a conspiracy theory after all. There may be something in it. Although, of course, a lot more research would have to be done before you could start to argue this with any great degree of conviction. But I think it's certainly thought-provoking, it's certainly worth thinking about, and it's certainly worth investigating in more detail. That a paedophile ascendancy, that you would get paedophiles and ebophiles in positions of power. That is what would be predicted by these studies, and that is what we appear to be seeing. Okay, well, I hope you have found this video to be of interest, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have, please, please, please subscribe, because it really, really helps me if you subscribe and get more advertising, and then I can do more videos. If you're a very lovely person, I really, really hope you might consider, you could fund me a little bit on Patreon or on Subscribestar. You may be interested in a number of my books on this topic. My book, Churchill's Headmaster, The Sadist Nearly Saved the British Empire, which is subject around the paedophilia and that kind of thing, is coming out quite soon, so you may be interested in that. If you have any questions, please get in touch in the comments section. I get a lot of comments more recently, so if you want to guarantee an answer, then feel free to email me. I've been corresponding with a number of people on various subjects, and it's been very, very interesting, very, very fruitful I hope for them, but certainly for me. And so that's been great, and I'd like to thank all those again who tuned in to my live chat with Kevin MacDonald, and I thank all the super chats involved. Very, very kind of you. I hope you're doing a new one with him quite soon. And as I say, what I can say is thank you for listening, and I will see you soon. And if you have any ideas for things you'd like me to cover, of course, again, please get in touch. And goodbye.